The Church Growth and Giving Show, your resource for growing faithful communities. Brought to you by Vanco, helping tens of thousands of churches thrive for over 20 years. Join Jordan and Hannah as they share insights drawn from decades of church giving and engagement expertise.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Church Growth and Giving Show.
I've got something really exciting to dive into today. It's a topic that might not sound super thrilling at first, but trust me, it's crucial for every church leader and team member.
Ooh, you've sparked my curiosity already, Jordan. What is it?
It's related to church finances, but this time we're talking about something even more fundamental: property taxes, specifically church property tax exemptions.
Property taxes for churches. I always thought churches were just exempt. Isn't that like a given?
That's a common assumption, Hannah, and in many cases, it's true. Generally, churches are exempt from property taxes in the US, but it's not always automatic, and it's definitely not always straightforward. There are nuances and variations depending on where you are and specific rules that churches need to be aware of.
Okay, that's more complex than I thought. So let's start with the basics. Why are churches generally exempt in the first place? What's the big idea behind it?
It really goes back to the First Amendment of the Constitution, that whole separation of church and state thing. The government wants to protect religious freedom, and taxing churches could be seen as interfering with religious practices. So, these exemptions are a way to avoid that kind of government entanglement. Plus, many states see churches as beneficial to society, providing community services and support that lighten the load on the government in some ways.
That makes sense. So it's like a recognition of the unique role churches play. But you mentioned it's not always simple. Where do things get complicated?
Well, the federal government sets a kind of general principle, but the actual property tax laws, they're really determined at the state and local level. And that's where you see a lot of variation. What qualifies for an exemption in California might be slightly different in Texas, Florida, or wherever. And even within a state, county, or city rules can add another layer.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all situation then. Churches really need to understand the rules specific to their location.
Yeah. And it's not just about location, it's also about how the church property is being used. That's a big one. The exemption usually applies to property used exclusively for religious purposes. Keywords there are exclusively and religious purposes.
Okay, so if a church is just using its building for worship services, Bible studies, typical church stuff, they're probably in the clear?
Generally, yes. Space is used for worship, ministry activities, religious education. Those are almost always exempt. But things get trickier when you start using church property for other things. Commercial activities, for example.
Commercial activities like if a church opened a coffee shop in its building, or rented out space to a business.
Yeah, that's where the exceptions start to kick in. If a church rents out its building or part of its property for business activities, think hosting for profit events, leasing space to a retail store, even charging for parking to non members, that portion of the property, or sometimes even the whole property, could lose its tax exempt status.
Wow, okay. So a church with a big parking lot that starts charging for parking during the week that could actually trigger property taxes on the parking lot?
It might. And it's not just parking lots. Think about churches that operate bookstores or cafes on their property, especially if they're open to the general public and operating like any other business. Those activities can complicate things.
This is starting to sound like a real minefield. So churches can't just assume they're exempt.
Absolutely. And that's why understanding these rules is so important. It's not about trying to avoid taxes unfairly, it's about being compliant, avoiding unintentional mistakes, and making sure the church stays focused on its mission without unexpected financial burdens.
So what kind of things qualify as religious purposes then? Is it just worship services?
It's broader than just worship services, thankfully. Religious education, ministry activities, charitable outreach, these generally fall under that umbrella. But again, the specifics can vary depending on state and local laws, and that's why it's always best to check your local jurisdiction's rules. I mean, state and county tax codes really are the key here. Federal law sets the stage, but local rules are what really determine if a church qualifies for that property tax exemption. Some states, for example, are very strict and require churches to prove that the property is exclusively used for religious purposes. Others might have a slightly broader interpretation, or maybe they just require an annual filing to maintain the exemption.
An annual filing? Like, even if nothing has changed, churches might need to file something every year just to keep their exempt status?
In some places, yes, it's like a renewal process, and local tax assessors, they have the authority to review how a property is being used and decide if the exemption applies. They might even conduct audits or inspections in certain areas. So the variability is huge depending on where you are. It really boils down to location when it comes to church property tax exemptions.
Okay, so, first takeaway. Know your local and state rules inside and out. Got it. But what specifically makes a church qualify? Are there, like, official criteria they have to meet?
Yes, there are. And it starts with the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service. To even be considered for property tax exemption, churches have to meet certain IRS requirements. First and foremost, they must operate as nonprofit organizations. That means they can't distribute profits to individuals. Any money the church earns has to be reinvested back into its mission.
Nonprofit, that's pretty standard for churches, right?
Yeah, it is. And the IRS also requires that churches serve a religious purpose, which, as we touched on, includes things like worship, religious education, and outreach programs. They also have to steer clear of political campaigns and substantial lobbying activities. Engaging in those kinds of things too much can jeopardize their tax exempt status.
So the IRS sets these broad guidelines, and then the states, they add their own layers?
You've got it. Every single state, plus Washington, D.C., exempts churches from property tax in some way. But the extent of that exemption, that's where the state specific criteria come in. Like we mentioned before, some states are stricter about exclusive religious use. California, for example, their rules might only exempt property used for worship, education, or related charitable activities. So, if a church in California does have that bookstore or coffee shop on its property, they could lose the exemption on that specific portion.
Okay, California's stricter. What about somewhere else, like you mentioned Texas earlier?
Yeah, Texas tends to be a bit more lenient. They offer exemptions for property used for religious, educational, and charitable purposes. It's a slightly broader scope. However, even in Texas, if a church rents out its building for non religious events regularly, they might still risk losing the exemption for those areas. It really comes down to how the property is being used day to day.
Property use that seems to be the recurring theme here. It's not just owning the property as a church, it's how you're using it that really determines the tax status.
You nailed it, Hannah. How church owned property is used is the key factor. Worship services, Sunday school, youth groups, ministry events, generally tax exempt. Business ventures, commercial rentals, that's where the red flags start to appear. Think about parsonages, for instance, the homes provided for pastors or clergy. Those are usually exempt if they're actively used as a residence connected to the church's mission. But if a church owns a piece of land that's just sitting vacant, unused, that can be a gray area.
Unused land. So, if a church is thinking about future expansion and buys a plot of land to build on later, but it just sits empty for a few years, they could be paying property taxes on that?
Potentially, yes. Some states might deny the exemption if the land isn't currently being used for a direct religious purpose. It's all about current use, and that's why planning and documentation are so crucial. Churches need to be really clear about their intended use for all their properties and how they're actually being utilized.
This is getting more and more detailed. So, if a church wants to make sure they are properly exempt, what do they actually do? Is there an application process? Forms to fill out?
Yes, there is definitely an application process. It's not automatic and it involves several steps, both at the federal and state levels. The first thing a church needs to do even before thinking about property tax, is to establish itself as a nonprofit organization. That's foundational. This usually means formally incorporating the church and drafting articles of incorporation and bylaws that clearly state its religious purpose and nonprofit nature.
Okay, so get the legal structure in place first. What's next?
Next, you need to apply for 501c3 status from the IRS. That's the official recognition as a tax-exempt religious organization at the federal level. This involves filing Form 1023 from the IRS. It's the application for 501c3 status. It's pretty detailed, asking for information about the church's structure, activities, finances, everything. There's also a simpler version, Form 1023EZ, for smaller organizations, but Form 1023 is the standard one for most churches.
Got it. Federal approval first. Then what about the state level?
Once you have that federal 501c3 status, you need to check with your state tax authorities. Each state will have its own set of requirements and paperwork to qualify for property tax exemption and other state-specific tax benefits. There might be additional state forms to fill out, or specific filings required. You'll need to contact your state's Department of Revenue or equivalent agency to get the specifics for your location.
So it's like a two-tiered process. Federal, then state. And once you're approved, is that it? Set it and forget it?
No, it's definitely not set it and forget it. Maintaining tax exempt status is an ongoing responsibility. Many exemptions require periodic renewals, and there are annual filings to keep track of, like Form 990 with the IRS.
This is all incredibly helpful, Jordan. It's clear that church property tax exemption is not as simple as just assuming churches are automatically exempt. There are rules, regulations, and ongoing responsibilities involved.
Exactly. And navigating it all can feel overwhelming. That's why we always recommend church leaders take proactive steps to ensure compliance. Review your tax filings annually, keep meticulous records of property use and finances, and don't hesitate to seek professional advice from a tax expert or legal professional who specializes in nonprofit and religious organizations. It's an investment that can save you a lot of headaches and potential financial burdens in the long run. We also have a free guide on church property taxes that you can find in the show notes. It goes into far more detail than our discussion.
Great advice, Jordan. And speaking of resources, I know we have something special for our listeners today, right?
We sure do. We're offering our listeners a free guide called The Church Treasurer's Guide to Perfect Finances, which includes some fantastic templates: a professional committee agenda template, a strategic budget planning template, and a done for you financial statement template. These are incredibly helpful tools to keep your church finances organized and compliant, including property tax related records. You can download it right now for free. We'll put a link in the show notes. It's been downloaded by over 2,000 churches already.
Fantastic! Make sure to grab that free guide, everyone. And Jordan, thank you so much for shedding light on this important topic of church property tax exemptions. It's definitely something every church leader needs to be informed about.
My pleasure, Hannah. Always happy to help churches grow and thrive, and that includes staying financially healthy and compliant.
And that's all the time we have for today's episode of the Church Growth and Giving Show. Join us next time for more insights and tips to help your church flourish.